Imagine a ticking taximeter, but you're not actually sitting in the back of a cab watching the city roll by. You're just sitting in your living room.
Right, just going about your day.
Exactly. But this meter is running relentlessly, 24/7. And the numbers aren't creeping up by pennies either. They are spinning wildly. $57 every single second.
Yeah, click, click. Yeah, every second.
It's just a massive invisible drain happening in the background of your daily life. And I think the most unsettling part of that visual is that you are the one paying the fare, even if you never hailed the cab in the first place.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So welcome to another deep dive. Today, we are tracking down that ticking meter. Our mission is to unpack this massive, slow-moving financial crisis that is hidden right beneath the surface of public education funding, specifically in Washington state.
It is a wild situation.
It really is. And we've got a fascinating, honestly, pretty dense stack of sources today. We're looking at forensic audits, legal templates, school board resolutions, and some pretty heavy educational science reports, which is quite the mix.
Right. But what we are looking at through all these documents is a completely unprecedented, legally aggressive, and scientifically backed rebellion that local school districts are currently planning.
Because, this isn't just your standard bureaucratic squabble over school budgets. We are talking about constitutional law here.
Yeah.
We're talking about redefining the legal parameters of evidence-based learning,
Right.
and really a multi-billion-dollar fight over your taxpayer money.
Absolutely. Now, I do want to throw out a quick disclaimer before we get into the weeds here. The documents we are analyzing today, they do not pull their punches.
No, they definitely don't.
Not at all. They use some incredibly aggressive language. Like, some of these sources outright accuse the state legislature of running a levy swindle.
Yeah, that's a direct quote.
Right. So I want to be super clear. We aren't here to take sides on the politics or, validate that specific rhetoric. We are strictly tearing into the math, the constitutional mechanisms, and the scientific frameworks these sources are proposing. We're just reporting what the documents say.
Exactly. Just following the data.
So let's unpack this. The central claim in the forensic audit we have is that Washington state has incurred a $15+ billion restitution debt to its school districts between 2018 and 2026.
$15 billion.
Yeah, $15 billion with a B.
And to really wrap our heads around what a $15 billion shortfall actually looks like, we kind of have to look at the micromath.
Okay, let's do that.
Going back to that ticking meter you mentioned, the audit calculations showed the state is currently defaulting on its constitutional funding duty at a rate of over $5 million a day.
$5 million every single day.
Every day. And that breaks down to roughly $57.87 a second.
Wow.
Yeah. Just in the time it took us to introduce this deep dive, that meter racked up nearly $7,000 in new debt.
That is staggering.
Right. And the mechanism driving this massive shortfall is what the sources refer to as unfunded mandates. So Washington state constitution, specifically Article IX, has a very unique clause. It states that fully funding education is the state's paramount duty.
Right. And that wording is key. It doesn't say it's a high priority or like a top 3 goal. It is the absolute highest legal obligation of the state government.
Exactly. But when you look at the actual budget ledgers in these sources, the state's share of the K-12 operating budget has mysteriously dropped. It went from 52% in 2019 down to 43% projected for 2025.
Which just leaves this gaping void in the budget.
Yeah, the state mandates a certain level of service, but then they refuse to appropriate the actual cash required to deliver it.
I was actually trying to find a good way to visualize how this levy swindle actually works in practice, because honestly, the math can get a bit abstract.
Oh, for sure. It's dense.
Right. So it's essentially like being a doctor who is ordered by a hospital administrator to perform a complex mandatory surgery. But the administrator refuses to buy anesthesia to save the hospital money.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, so the surgery is mandated, but the tools to do it humanely are totally unfunded. So the doctor has to step out into the waiting room and beg the patient's family for donations just to buy the anesthesia.
Wow.
In this scenario, the local school district is the doctor, and the local property taxpayers are the family being hit up for cash through these local enrichment levies.
That captures the dynamic perfectly, honestly. Because Well, let's look at a concrete example from the audit regarding substitute teachers. The state legally mandates that certificated staff receive 12 sick days per year.
Which, is standard labor practice.
It is, totally standard. But the state formula only funds 4 days of substitute teacher pay.
Wait, really? Only 4?
Only 4. So if a teacher takes their legally mandated 5th sick day, the state provides $0 to put an adult in that classroom.
That makes no sense.
Right. And in a mid-sized district like Ridgefield, covering that specific unfunded gap costs the local district about $1 million annually.
Just for substitutes.
Just for substitutes.
Jeez. And the sources show this compounding across every sector. Like, utility costs are up 40%. Insurance premiums have jumped 100%. Yet the state's funding formula for materials, supplies, and operating costs, they call it the MSOC, is essentially frozen.
Yeah, they just ignore the inflation.
And then you hit the most devastating gap of all, which is special education. The sources calculate the state is underfunding special education by roughly $5.4 billion statewide.
And that is a huge problem because special education involves strict, federally mandated one-to-one services. A district cannot legally, or frankly morally, deny those services.
All right, you can't just skip it.
Exactly. So when the state shorts them $5 billion, the districts have to cannibalize their general education funds. They are forced to hollow out other areas, cutting music or sports or advanced academics, just to keep the lights on and comply with special ed law.
Which forces local school boards into this brutal dilemma. The sources outline 2 paths that districts are currently trapped in. Path A is what they call the descent.
Right. Not a great name.
No, this means a district just accepts the state's math, they execute mass layoffs, they cram 35 kids into a classroom, and they just watch the quality of education plummet.
Yeah.
Then Path B is the levy gamble. They refuse to let the kids suffer, so they repeatedly go back to the local taxpayers with massive property tax hikes, hoping the community will vote to subsidize the state's broken budget.
And both of those paths eventually hit a wall. You either destroy the school system from within, or you trigger extreme levy fatigue where voters finally say no and the district goes over a financial cliff anyway.
Okay, so put yourself in their shoes. If you are a local school board member, your district is bleeding $57 a second, and your local taxpayers are completely tapped out. How do you legally stop this without breaking the law yourself? Because, you still have to pass a balanced budget.
Right. And this is where we shift to the proposed rebellion. The sources detail a third option, which they call Path C, or the restoration. The mechanism for this is a legal shield titled the Paramount Duty Preservation Act.
Okay.
It is a template resolution designed for all 295 school districts in Washington to adopt simultaneously.
Now, I spent a lot of time reading the legal arguments in this act, and I have to admit, my first reaction was total skepticism. Like, can a local school board just legally refuse to balance their budget?
That sounds crazy, right?
Yeah. If they vote down the required cuts, aren't the board members personally liable? That sounds like a fast track to the state taking over the district in receivership.
And that is the exact trap the state relies on. They bank on that fear. But the genius of this act's legal framework is how it actually flips the jurisdiction. It relies on the Superior Oath Doctrine.
Okay, break that down for me.
So when a school board member takes office, they don't swear an oath to the state legislature's annual budget spreadsheet. They swear an oath to uphold the Washington state Constitution.
Ah. And the Constitution holds education as the paramount duty.
Precisely. The argument presented in the act is that if a board cuts teachers to accommodate a legislative budget deficit, they're intentionally degrading the educational system to a substandard level.
Right.
Therefore, executing those cuts would mean actively participating in an unconstitutional act. Following a secondary state statute, like the budget, does not give you immunity to violate the primary constitution.
So going back to our hospital analogy, the doctor's primary medical oath forbids them from doing the surgery without anesthesia, even if the hospital administrator's budget rule demands it. The higher oath legally overrides the lower rule.
Yes. The act actually uses the legal concept of force majeure, which is a supervening impossibility. Think of it like a collapsed bridge.
Okay.
If a bridge collapses, a school bus driver isn't expected to just drive the bus into the canyon because the route says to go straight.
Right, that would be insane.
Exactly. The state's $15 billion funding gap has created a legally impossible environment. It's a collapsed bridge. Therefore, the Paramount Duty Preservation Act functions as an emergency brake. When passed, it legally stays all personnel layoffs, what districts call reductions in force, or RIFs.
The actual mechanics of how a local district executes this rebellion are just fascinating. It's a highly orchestrated sequence.
Even methodical.
Yeah. So first, the school board publicly votes down the proposed budget cuts, citing their constitutional oath. Second, they pass this Preservation Act. Third, they literally serve the state with a notice of default. They send the governor and the legislature an itemized invoice for their district's share of that $15 billion.
And the final, most critical step is that the board authorizes the issuance of county warrants.
Okay, let's pause and unpack that because I really had to dig into the financial plumbing to understand this part. What exactly is a county warrant? Are these districts just printing their own money?
Not exactly printing money, no, but it's a really powerful financial mechanism. A county warrant is essentially a registered interest-bearing order to pay.
Okay.
If the state cuts off cash flow because the district refused to balance its budget with the cuts, the district doesn't just shut its doors. Instead, they issue these warrants to their teachers and vendors. And the warrants are backed by the county treasurer. It forces the county to physically register the debt.
So the teachers still get paid, the lights stay on, and the school continues to operate as a matter of public safety.
Yes, but it forces a massive liability onto the county and state ledgers. The state cannot simply ignore millions of dollars in registered municipal warrants without triggering a systemic credit downgrade.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it forces the state legislature out of their back rooms and pushes the entire conflict directly onto the docket of the state Supreme Court.
They are essentially forcing a constitutional showdown, but that leads to the next massive problem. Okay, you hit the emergency brake, you've stopped the cuts, you've served the state with a lawsuit, but that just freezes a broken system in place, right?
Right, you're just paused.
Yeah, you still have to actually teach the kids. If you tear down the old funding model, what is the blueprint for a system that actually works?
Well, the sources refer to the current system as the prototypical fiction. Right now, the state tries to figure out how many teachers a school needs by using a massive 95-person committee called the K-12 Funding Equity Work Group.
And the documents show this work group is just a mess. They are completely deadlocked. They have zero funding for actual data modeling.
None at all.
Instead of looking at what kids actually need, they just spend their time haggling over arbitrary political compromises to fit a predetermined budget number.
Right. They are managing a decline, not optimizing a system. The solution proposed in these sources is called the Education Funding Blueprint, specifically Revision V37.
Okay, and what does that do?
The core philosophy here is a total paradigm shift. Instead of politicians guessing staffing ratios, the blueprint ties the constitutional definition of ample funding directly to the hard science of human learning.
I was looking at the data they cite for this, specifically the work of a researcher named Hattie, and it's wild. It basically turns the art of education into a mathematical formula.
It really does.
Hattie created a database called MetaX, where he synthesized decades of educational research involving hundreds of millions of students to figure out what actually works.
Right. And he established a universal metric called an effect size. In Hattie's research, an effect size of 0.40 is the absolute baseline.
So unpack why 0.40 is the magic number.
Because almost anything a teacher does in a classroom has an effect greater than 0. I mean, a student will learn something just by being in a room and aging a year, right?
Right.
But Hattie found that the average effect size of all educational interventions combined is 0.40. Therefore, 0.40 represents exactly 1 year of typical student growth for 1 year of instructional time.
Got it. So 1 year of input equals 1 year of growth.
Exactly. So the Blueprint V37 takes that scientific metric and makes it the objective legal floor for constitutional funding.
Yeah.
If the state funds a staffing ratio or an intervention that has an effect size below 0.40, they are mathematically funding suboptimal, below average growth.
Which would be unconstitutional under the Paramount Duty Clause.
Yes. Under this new framework, any state budget cut that forces a district's operations to drop below that 0.40 threshold is immediately classified as a violation of the requirement for ample provision.
To make this incredibly concrete, let's look at how this applies to advanced placement classes or gifted programs, what the text calls acceleration. The Hattie data shows that acceleration has a massive effect size of 0.88.
Which is huge. That is more than double the 0.40 floor required for ample education. It produces over 2 years of growth in a single year.
Right. So under the current system, if a district is broke, they might cut the AP program because it's seen as an extra. But under the Blueprint's legal framework, cutting a 0.88 impact program is legally actionable.
Exactly.
You aren't just trimming the fat. You are intentionally removing the highest growth mechanism in the entire district.
Mm.
You are knowingly degrading the system below the scientific standard of success.
And the blueprint doesn't just fix the instructional science. It completely rewires the accounting mechanisms, too. Right now, the state uses wildly complex regionalization formulas.
Oh, these formulas are a nightmare.
They really are. They try to guess the cost of living in different zip codes, but they are consistently years behind actual inflation. They essentially punish districts for existing in areas where housing or electricity suddenly spikes.
And the blueprint replaces that with something called functional parity.
Yes. Functional parity throws out the regionalization guessing game entirely. It dictates that the state simply pays the actual real-world invoices for market rate staffing and operations. Well, if a district's utility bill goes up 40%, the state pays the invoice. If market rate teacher salaries in a specific county rise, the state covers the actual payroll cost. It removes the massive wealth gaps between affluent districts that can easily pass local levies to cover inflation and rural or lower-income districts that just cannot.
Okay, I want to pivot here and bring this directly to you, the listener. You might be sitting at home thinking, look, I don't have kids in the public school system. I'm not a teacher. Why should I care about John Hattie's effect sizes or county warrants or functional parity?
It's a fair question.
Yeah.
But you should care because this entire framework ultimately comes down to your wallet, your property taxes, and the economic health of your state. The blueprint is not a cheap fix.
Definitely not.
No. To fully implement this scientific standard and correct the massive $15 billion deficit, the sources projected will cost the state $29.2 billion over an 8-year period from 2026 to 2034.
Okay, I have to push back hard on this. $29 billion. That is an astronomical amount of money. The sources frame this as a win for the taxpayer, but how do they mathematically justify calling a $29 billion expense a savings?
I know, it sounds contradictory until you trace where the money is currently coming from. That $29 billion isn't entirely new spending for society. It is a massive transfer of liability.
Oh, so...
Right now, because the state is dodging the bill, local communities are paying for it through property taxes. When the state finally assumes its full constitutional burden under the blueprint, it triggers an immediate $19.75 billion in direct local levy relief.
So that enrichment levy you vote on every 2 to 4 years, the one that keeps hiking your property taxes, gets neutralized. That is nearly $20 billion that stays directly in the pockets of local homeowners and renters over that 8-year period.
Exactly. And the plan actually culminates in what the sources call a Year 10 tax swap. By the end of the implementation phase, it entirely abolishes the legal need for local enrichment levies to pay for any basic educational services.
Wow.
For the local taxpayer, the net result on their property tax bill is total fiscal neutrality. You're no longer paying a hidden, localized tax to subsidize a broken state budget.
And the economic dividend extends way beyond just property tax relief, right? The sources outline how properly funding the system at the 0.40 effect size floor creates massive downstream efficiencies. By funding K-3 ratios at 1 to 15 and providing universal early screening, the state fundamentally alters the trajectory of its population.
Right, the compounding effects are huge.
Yeah, the data projects $3.2 billion in savings from reduced social costs alone.
And we are talking about highly quantifiable metrics here.
Yeah.
Lower juvenile incarceration rates, a drastic reduction in the need for long-term adult remediation, and higher workforce participation rates.
Furthermore, they calculate another $1.8 billion saved strictly through workforce stability. The current system relies on this chaotic annual cycle of handing out pink slips to young teachers every spring because the budget is short, only to desperately try and hire them back in August.
That's so inefficient.
Right. The state loses brilliant educators to other professions and spends a fortune endlessly recruiting and retraining new staff. Stopping that churn is incredibly lucrative.
So when you tally it all up, shifting the primary funding burden back to the state's general fund, applying the $19 billion in local levy relief, adding the social savings, and accounting for the workforce stabilization, the forensic audit projects that Washington would see a net systemic gain of $24.75 billion in community wealth and economic outcomes.
It fundamentally flips the narrative. Spending the money to hit that scientific benchmark isn't just about doing the right thing for kids. It's literally the most fiscally responsible, high-return investment a state can make.
It proves that the old political adage, we can't afford to fix it, is mathematically backwards. We are currently paying a massive premium to maintain a failing system.
We started this deep dive looking at a hidden, invisible meter quietly draining $57 every single second from local communities. We've seen how 295 independent school districts could potentially link arms using the Paramount Duty Preservation Act and county warrants to force a legal reckoning.
Which is amazing to think about.
It really is. We've explored the mechanics of replacing political guesswork with hard, quantifiable educational science using the 0.40 effect size floor. And ultimately, we unpacked how forcing the state to follow its own constitution could generate $24 billion in net economic gains.
And I think what's truly profound about studying these documents is that this framework isn't just isolated to Washington state schools. It serves as a masterclass in civic mechanics. Well, it shows how local entities don't have to just play defense against state shortfalls. By weaponizing data, constitutional law, and collective action, communities can force systemic accountability from the bottom up.
It's a remarkably aggressive template for taking the power back.
It is. As we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to consider as you watch your own local governments operate. When we as a society legally mandate a service, whether that is public education or maintaining infrastructure or providing emergency health care, at what point does the state's failure to fund the actual cost of that mandate transition from being just bad budgeting to an active violation of our civic contract?
That's a heavy question.
And if modern data science can now perfectly calculate the exact cost of success, can we ever truly afford the price of ignoring it?
That is a question every taxpayer in every state should be asking. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the numbers behind the headlines. Look closely at the math your local boards are voting on. And remember, the next time you hear a politician talk about an unavoidable budget shortfall, listen closely. You might just hear that taximeter ticking in the background. We'll catch you next time.